The most detailed account that I could find describing the peace that was gained with Enriquillo was written by Oviedo. And he lets us know that on the 8th of May, 1533, Barrio Nuevo set out in his ship to find him. He says that he took one ship with him and about 32 other Spanish settlers and indigenous people to help carry their load. And he sailed westward all along the coast, going from port to port, trying to find Enriquillo. And because the boat was large and he didn't want to get too close to the shore, he sent out a smaller boat. He ended up in the town of Yaquimo, and there he disembarked. But it wasn't the first time he disembarked. He disembarked in several of the ports going in and out of the land. Oviedo says that this took him 2 months. By the time he arrived in Yaquimo, it was already July. In Yaquimo, he went inland and he found a settlement. It seemed to have been abandoned, but there were still conucos nearby or gardens nearby with food. So he came to the assumptions that indigenous people who lived there were probably out hunting or fishing. He then decided to go back on his ship. He sent out people to try to get some guides from the settlement called Jaguana. The natives that he got from Jaguana, one of them said, "Hey, I know where Enriquillo is. I can easily find him for you." So Barrio Nuevo said, "Great, here's a letter. Take it to him and come back with a response." He let 20 days go by before concluding that this man was never going to come back. Fed up with waiting, he decided to leave 2 men on the boat. And he said, "You know what? I'm gonna have to go find him myself. I'm gonna use this other guy that I have who came from Jaguana. Let's try to find him on foot." At some point, a native woman told them in the general direction that Enriquillo would be, and they traveled 3.5 days until they found another settlement. In this Yucayeque, they ended up finding 4 indigenous people. They decided, you know what, let's kidnap these 4. Maybe they have some info. They got out of these 4 a very important piece of information. They told Barrio Nuevo that Enriquillo was at a lake called Aiba Guanex or Aiba Guanej, as it originally was called, now known as the Lago de Enriquillo. This lake at the time was surrounded by thorns and deep jungle. But Barrio Nuevo was on a mission. He decided to go there, even though he knew that it was going to be extremely difficult to actually get to the lake. Before reaching El Lago Enriquillo, they could see that there was a large yucayeque in the way. It had a good number of bohios, so they concluded that this might be the location where Enriquillo would go. So they decided to spend the night close by. Oviedo says that this particular yucayeque could have at one time hold 1,500 Tainos. It was that large. He does say that this yucayeque was used by Enriquillo to cultivate tobacco and make cigars. So Barrio Nuevo's assertion that this village was used by Enriquillo was correct. But Enriquillo wasn't there because the next day he attacked the village and found it empty. There were no people there. However, the houses, the bohios did have the typical furnishings, so he concluded again that the people had to be close by. So he ordered his men not to touch anything, but to only take what was needed to carry water. And as they dug through everything, they found a path. Even though this path was through dense jungle, they could tell that it was wide enough to accommodate a canoe, a large canoe, and also to allow someone to come back. So a 2-lane road. They walked through it, and as they walked through it, they started to hear a sound. It was rhythmic and steady, and they quickly came to the conclusion that somebody was chopping wood. Echoes of the blows of the axe surrounded them, and so he ordered the men to stop and listen. He quickly sent out several men to surround the area, and they were able to capture this Taino who was peacefully chopping wood. They fell on him, captured him, tied him. And here Oviedo comments that throughout their entire time that they were walking through this path, not a single branch was torn or bent because Enriquillo had made it a point to make sure that nobody could track him. And supposedly, Enriquillo was so serious about his safety and the safety of his people that if anybody caused them to be found, they would be killed. After having captured this native, Barrio Nuevo seemed to realize that there were other natives probably in the area, and he didn't want to alert anyone to his presence. So he left two of the natives that he had brought out in the path, and he had all of his men go into the forest with the native that they had captured. There, he then questioned him, "Where is Enriquillo?" The guy spilled the beans and he said, "You know what? Enriquillo's about half a league from here, but you're going to have to cross a certain point in the lake in order to find him." So this meant that they had to walk inside the lake, and the levels of water in the lake were varied. It wasn't all the same. There were parts that were deep, there were parts that were shallow, and in the certain part that they had to cross, the water was going to get up to their knees, but they needed to cross over to the other side to a very dense forest of mangles or mangroves, mangles being the Taino word for these type of trees. Taino told them that the path was difficult, but he gave them a basic layout. But now he said that Enriquillo was about a league and a half away, much farther than he had originally stated. And he might have left out one detail. Because when they approached the lake, there were several natives already on the other side. There were about 6 large canoes and 6 smaller canoes with 12 different indigenous people there. The moment that they saw Barrio Nuevo and his men, the natives began to shout. And Oviedo here says something a little strange to me because he says that the natives began to paddle and to hit the canoes so that the Christians would know that the Tainos were in them. That makes me think that either these canoes were very deep and you could lay in them and not be seen, probably. There had to be a reason for this particular comment. Then the natives began to do something interesting. They began to yell the following: "A la mar, Capitan, a la mar." They were looking straight at Barrio Nuevo. So his men were like, "Hey, answer. They're obviously talking to you." But Barrio Nuevo was like, "No, these natives have a captain. They might be yelling to him and not to me." But it seems like they might have heard him because Tainos then changed their chant to "Señor Capitán de su Majestad, a la mar, a la mar." So he walked out of the savannah being a Taino word that just meant a large plain that didn't have large trees in it. And what's incredible is that Barrio Nuevo had not gotten to the edge of the lake when he was spotted by Enrique's men. So he was walking through the savannah, and this particular savannah is described as having very tall grass. So he had to walk a little bit more to actually reach the lake. So he approached them and asked them directly, "Do you know where Enriquillo is? I've come to speak to him. I have a letter from the king." He took the opportunity to also ask about the native he had originally sent. He wanted to know if he had reached them. Enriquillo's men said, "No, we haven't seen him, but we already knew that you were coming." Barrio Nuevo quickly told them that he had a relative of Enriquillo with him and that he wanted them to take her so that she could let Enriquillo know about his arrival. But Enriquillo's men did not want to take her. Barrio Nuevo had to convince them because they said that Enrique would be angry. They finally said yes, and so La Taina walked into the lake up to where the water got waist deep, and they were then able to pull her onto a canoe. They told Barrio Nuevo to wait here as they were going to take her to see their lord, Enriquillo. So they left the lake and went into the savannah, into the safety of the tall grass. And the following day, Oviedo says about 2 hours after sunrise, they could see at the distance 2 canoes coming back. Within the canoe was one of Enriquillo's top officials, Martin de Alfaro, his cousin. This Taino was one of the main captains. He also came with the indigenous woman that Barrio Nuevo had given to them the day before, and they came to shore with their spears and their swords. Leaving his men in the savannah, Barrio Nuevo quickly approached the shoreline And when these natives came off their canoes, he embraced them. He went around embracing every single one. Martin de Alfaro stayed on shore with Barrio Nuevo, but the rest of the natives went back into the canoes. Barrio Nuevo was surprised at the fact that Alfaro could speak very well Spanish and was easy to understand. And the first thing that Alfaro told Barrio Nuevo was that Enriquillo was pleased to meet with him, but that he needed a favor. Could he come to where he was at? Because he was very ill. Barrio Nuevo took this as a test. He thought that Enrique was trying to determine if he was there to capture him or if he was there to actually speak to him. He quickly said yes, no problem, even though his men were very upset that he had agreed to go and meet with Enriquillo on his terms. The men were scared. They might be killed, they could be tortured, but Barrio Nuevo knew that this was extremely important to get done. So he took 15 of his men and followed Alfaro into the dense tropical forest, a path that is said to have been extremely difficult. At times, they were even crawling and dragging themselves along the forest floor. While walking this very difficult path, the 15 men he brought with him, began to complain. And it seems that this ticked off Barrio Nuevo. He did not expect his soldiers to begin complaining about having to fulfill their duty. And so he told them the following: Señores, típico dominicano, señores, yo vine acá con vosotros, no a más de servir a Dios al emperador, nuestro Señor. No será bien que se conozca temor en ninguno de vosotros. So we shouldn't be showing any fear. Pues que sos hidalgos, personas experimentadas en mayores peligros. In other words, this is cake. Why are you guys complaining? Cuando más que aquí no hay de que temer. Y el que quisiese tornarse, vuélvase. ¿Dónde quedan nuestros compañeros? He's like, go back to the other dudes. Aguárdeme allí. El que hubiere gana de me seguir y hacer lo que debe, haga lo que yo hago, porque yo no tengo de volver un paso atrás, aunque pensase escapar de morir. Que a esto vine venís y a ganar honra, y no a perderla. In other words, this is what you guys signed up for. What is this? And so, being the leader that he was, he continued on his way with his sword and a light lance in his hands, carrying nothing else. He wore a canvas or coarse linen doublet, breeches and leather gaiters from the knees down, and espadrilles on his feet. And Oviedo said that as a good captain and a courageous knight, he had his men follow him. We can be 100% sure that Barrio Nuevo was scared. He was fearful. He didn't know what was at the end of this path. But as the leader that he was, similar to Enrique, he had to give hope, he had to give confidence to his men. And so his small speech made effect, and they didn't complain anymore about what they were doing. They then arrived at a small cove, and he was so tired by this time that Barrio Nuevo sat underneath a tree. And as he looked up across the cove, he saw Enriquillo. He didn't want Enriquillo to think that he was sitting down to plan something against him. So he sent one of the mestizos that he had brought with him, with Alfaro, to please let Enriquillo know that he was just resting because he was tired. It was a horrible journey through the path, and that he would meet up with him however he wanted. But that if Enriquillo had any suspicion or if he was unsure of Barrio Nuevo's intentions, that he would return back, no problem, no issue, and they could speak later. He also let him know to not have any fear, that Enrique had been pardoned by the king himself, provided that he was willing to now come under the service of the king. He also told them that he had a letter from the king, and in the letter he could see for himself the terms of the peace. El Mestizo and Alfaro crossed over to where Enrique was with his other natives, and they told him what Barrio Nuevo had said. Enrique immediately said, yes, come over, I'm more than happy to meet with you here, and that he was upset that his natives hadn't cleared the path quick enough so that Barrio Nuevo could come over to speak with him. El Mestizo and Alfaro returned back to Barrio Nuevo, told him that he was more than welcome to cross over, and that he could even send for his other men that had been left in the savannah. He waited for the men to come from the savannah, and once they were there, they all crossed over to meet with Enriquillo. And as he approached the location, he saw that there was a large tree. There was a cotton blanket under the shade of this large tree. And Oviedo says that as soon as they saw each other, they embraced, they smiled, and with great joy, they held each other's hands. They then went to sit on the blanket and talk. Before all the discussions happened, Tamayo, we remember Tamayo, one of the rebels that joined Enriquillo, was also there. He went, greeted the captain, Barrio Nuevo, as well as all the other Taino chiefs who were allied to Enriquillo. There were about 6 principal captains, but in total, there were about 70 men there with their spears and their swords and their shields. This little detail had me crazy because it shows the adaptation of the Tainos to their situation. Oviedo says that most of these men had a special kind of armor on, from their armpits all the way down to their waist, so their midriff, right? All of this. They were wrapped in roped cotton, very thick rope cotton, to protect themselves from the swords of the Spanish. He says that they were all smeared in their war paint, which was usually a red color made from bija. And all along them, they had feathers of different colors, as they usually had on during battle. Barrio Nuevo then ordered his men to sit on one side of him, behind him, and Enriquillo ordered the same for his men. So we have these 2 captains sitting under a large tree on a cotton blanket with men sprawled out all behind them. It says that Barrio Nuevo was very honored to be able to speak with Enriquillo directly, and he told him the following: Enrique, muchas gracias debes dar a Dios nuestro Señor por la clemencia y misericordia que con vos usa en las mercedes señaladas, que os hace el emperador rey nuestro Señor. En se acordar de vos y os querer perdonar varios hierros y reduciros a su real servicio e obediencia, y querer que, como uno de sus vasallos, seas bien tratado. He goes on to say that the king just wants to resolve everything between them and wants Enriquillo to become a vassal of his kingdom, to be able to live freely under the king's command. He reminds him that he is baptized and he knows the sacraments and he knows that he is a Christian that wants to obey his majesty. He then says that he has a letter for him and hands it to Enriquillo, but Enriquillo hands it back. Enrique here supposedly says that he trusts Barrio Nuevo and asks him to please read the letter to him because he can no longer see. I imagine that he means like that he can't read, that he's farsighted, so that he needs him to read the letter for him. And so Barrio Nuevo said, yes, of course, I'll read it to you, no problem. And he reads the letter. Oviedo does not say what the letter actually says, but he says that Barrio Nuevo read it. He gives it back to Enrique and says, Lord Don Enrique, because supposedly this letter says Don Enrique. And this was a big deal. The fact that the king called Enrique Don transformed his status, because at this time the title was given mostly to nobility, and the nobility had certain rights and protections that other social statuses didn't have. In essence, by the king addressing Enrique as Don Enrique, it meant that he was now in a different position and that the Spanish authorities also had to see him differently. He was to be respected and listened to. And Barrio Nuevo immediately uses the title. And he says, Señor Don Enrique, besad la carta de su majestad y ponerla sobre vuestra cabeza. I had never heard of this before, but apparently placing the king's letter on your head was a sign of deep respect and submission. And so Enrique supposedly did this with great pleasure, very happy that finally this peace was happening. And so Barrio Nuevo gave him other letters from La Audiencia Real, a chancería de sus majestades. And this letter was a letter of assurance saying that they backed up Enrique 100% and that he was now free. It was sealed with the royal seal. Barrio Nuevo here gives a sort of personal speech to Enrique. And from what I've read of it, it seems like he was concerned with the peace lasting. Because he then tells Enrique, yo vine a esta isla por mandado del emperador rey, nuestro señor, con gente española de guerra, which is a lie, para que con ella y toda la que más hay en aquesta isla os haga guerra. So he tells them, look, I was sent here to fight you. He tells them that the king, which was not true, because they complain about the natives lying to them, but they were lying to the natives 24/7. He says that the king told them to offer him peace first. But we know through the notes of La Audiencia Real that this was actually something thought up on the island. Like, this was something that the officials of the island thought was a better option. And we know that Barrio Nuevo even waited for the letter offering peace before he sets out to look for Enrique. He tells them that the king is offering him to forget all of his transgressions, everything that happened, as long as he becomes a loyal servant to the crown. And as representative of the king, Barrio Nuevo dice, os mando y así de parte del rey, os mando y requiero que lo hagáis. So he says, I'm ordering you to accept this offer and do what you're told. Because this is a clemency, a favor that is being shown to you. He continues saying, mira que sos cristiano, e temed a Dios, e darle infinitas gracias, e nunca le desconozcáis tanta misericordia. So don't be ungrateful for what has been shown to you. Pues que os da lugar que os salváis y no perdáis el ánima, ni la persona. Porque aunque hasta aquí Él os ha guardado de los peligros de la guerra. So even though God has protected you up to this point from the consequences of your war, ha sido porque cuando os alzaste, tuviste alguna causa para apartaros de aquel pueblo donde vivides, pero no para desviarlos del servicio de Dios y de nuestro rey. He was saying, you had a reason to rebel, and we get it, but it doesn't mean that you will rebel against God, nor the king. And then he says something very, very interesting. He says, porque, en fin, si a noticia de su majestad llegara que habíades recibido algún agravio, sé cierto que lo mandara muy enteramente remediar y castigar, de manera que fuérades satisfecho y contento. So Barrio Nuevo is saying that if the king had known why Enriquillo had rebelled, he would have fixed it for him. He would have done something about it. And this was a common theme, once again, with the Spanish and the Tainos and the Native Americans in all of their territories. There were so many laws in place to protect the natives. But what was the problem? The natives didn't know about the laws. So how are they going to exert their rights if they didn't know about them? With this statement, Barrio Nuevo lays the responsibility of what happened in Bauruco on Enriquillo, because he's telling him that this all happened because you didn't say anything to the right people. And this is part of our own justice system. Your ignorance of the law doesn't excuse you from the consequences of the law. And so Barrio Nuevo continues saying, pero ya que todo aquello es pasado, so it already happened, lo que pasó, pasó, os digo y certifico que si ahora no venís de corazón y de obra conocer vuestra culpa, so if you don't acknowledge that this is your fault, y a obedecer a su majestad, perdonándonos como Él os perdona, que permitirá Dios que os perdáis presto, porque la soberbia os traerá la muerte. So if Enrique does not accept this pardon in heart and deed and acknowledges his guilt of what happened and not only acknowledge his guilt, but obey his majesty and accepts this pardon, because this is what this is. It's a pardon. Then God will allow you to perish soon, because pride will lead you to your death. He lets him know that if the war continues, it's not going to be how it was in the past. Oh no. Now it will be with fire and blood. It will be so intense that ni os podréis esconder, aunque fuese un curí o un pequeño gusano de debajo de la tierra. So even if you were a small worm underneath the earth, we will find you. You will be unable to hide. He then declares the Spanish kingdom to now be the most powerful kingdom in the world, y que entrarían por tantas partes que de lo más hondo y escondido os sacarán. He also reminds him that for the last 13 years, he's had little sleep, has lived with severe anxiety, and hasn't been able to hide anywhere and gain peace. Because facing the king of Spain is not like facing some other cacique, sino que es con el más alto y más poderoso señor y rey que hay debajo del cielo, a quien otros reyes y muchos reinos obedecen, y temen y le sirven. He says that if the king had learned the truth as to what was really happening, that Enriquillo long ago would have been reformed or punished, because it was the Catholic custom to first offer peace and then to give consequences. And here is where he lays out the point of what he's saying, that if you have come to understand fully what has been offered to you, then I will expect you to never again go into a rebellion. Porque la indignación de su majestad sería muy mayor, y el castigo ejecutado en vos y en vuestra gente con mayor rigor. He then says that he will now receive respect from all of the Christians, from all the royal officials, governors, and magistrates, because of the mercies that Jesus Christ has bestowed on him. Porque si amares vuestra vida y la de los vuestros, amaráis su real servicio y la paz. Liberáis vuestra ánima y las de muchos, y daráis seguridad a vuestra persona y a las de todos aquellos que os siguen. He says that he's been granted peace and security, that he can live in any part of the island that he wishes to, with the same freedoms as any other Christian subject. And he concludes saying, así que, pues me habéis entendido, decidme vuestra voluntad y lo que entendés hacer. Enrique was quiet during the entire time that Barrio Nuevo was speaking. And not only him, but all the men that were sitting behind him also were quiet. And here Enrique replies, and Oviedo records him saying, Yo no deseaba otra cosa sino la paz. Y conozco la merced que Dios y el emperador nuestro Señor me hacen en esto. Y por ello beso sus reales pies y manos. Es si hasta ahora no he venido en ello. So if he hadn't gone to the king in all this time, ha sido a causa de las burlas que me han hecho los cristianos, de la poca verdad que me han guardado. Y por esto no me he osado fiar o confiar de hombre de esta isla. Enrique, or Don Enrique, did not hold back. He then proceeded to tell Barrio Nuevo very specific instances of the betrayal of the Spanish. He was very clear as to why he had rebelled. He didn't do this just because he felt like it. He began to recount from the very beginning of his rebellion to this point in time. After he explained everything to Barrio Nuevo, he rose up and went to have a private meeting with the other caciques. He showed them the letters, they reviewed the contents, and then he shared with them his decision. He then turned back around, walked to Barrio Nuevo, and accepted the peace treaty from the King of Spain. Because we have to remember that peace had already been arranged in 1528 with Hernando de San Miguel. But in that treaty, nothing had been written. Enrique was just forced to give all the gold that he had taken from a ship and from various other settlements. And that was it. Nothing was put into stone, nothing was formalized. So it's understandable that Barrio Nuevo was nervous about this peace and he wanted to make sure that it was sealed. So they spoke about the terms of the peace, finalizing the loose ends, and Enrique promised to always keep the peace. He also said that he would go to the different caciques who were still fighting against the Spanish and convince them to stop. He also promised to return to the Spanish any blacks and any natives who ran away who had been enslaved. He would chase them, capture them, and bring them bound back to their masters. Oviedo says that from then on, Enriquillo was then called Don Enrique because that's what was in His Majesty's letter. Oviedo states that Enrique, after finally formalizing this peace, went back home to Mencia. And he actually ate with his wife after these meetings. And something we have to know is that he didn't go literally back to a bohio. We know that they were living in the forest, moving every couple of days, and she never left his side. She was in the forest waiting for him to come back. So while Enrique was back with Mencia, he left his captains with Barrio Nuevo and they joined him in a meal. This seemed to have been in the morning or early afternoon because Oviedo says that in the afternoon of this same day that the peace treaty was done, Enrique actually went back to Barrio Nuevo and wanted to finalize what he needed to do in terms of capturing the blacks and the cimarrones, because the word cimarron originally meant Indians who fled. It had nothing to do with the blacks. But because the blacks were also fleeing, the term came to mean the Africans who were fleeing slavery. He wanted Barrio Nuevo to pick two constables for him, and these constables were going to be assigned finding these runaways. And I think this Enriquillo wanted this to be done immediately because he didn't want anyone to come back and say that he wasn't doing his part or that he didn't make the proper arrangements. He also wanted the set amount of money to be established for the capture of each one of these individuals. Barrio Nuevo picked the constables and set the amount. And he also told Enrique if he wanted any livestock or any other things. But Enrique says no. Oviedo later on tells us that Enrique only asked for religious images to be brought to him, but that later on he might, because at the moment he was living up in the mountains, he didn't have land where livestock could graze, but that maybe after he came down from the mountain and was assured of the peace, because Enrique was also cautious with the Spanish. He didn't believe them, as he's already stated. The main reason his rebellion lasted so long was because of the continued lies that the Spanish would tell him. And so he was cautious. Barrio Nuevo also gave permission for Enrique and his natives to trade. And it's noted here that they didn't have any gold to trade. And I really think that the whole point of this kind of order was to see if Enrique had gold, because there was really no reason to establish this. They would have to trade anyways in order to engage in commerce. So I'm pretty sure that this was just to kind of investigate if Enrique still had gold in his possession, because the gold belonged to the king. Later on, it's not specific if this was the same day or another day, but they ate again together, Barrio Nuevo and Enrique and his men. It's noted here that Enrique didn't eat. At the time, it was believed that it was because he was still suspicious. He thought the food was poisoned. But unfortunately, later on, we learned that Enrique was extremely ill and he didn't have an appetite. Enrique then went back to Mencia, his wife. I'm pretty sure that she was a rock for him, his safe place, where he could go and be himself and feel at peace. Barrio Nuevo and his men ended up sleeping again in the savannah. They didn't have any other place where they felt comfortable enough to sleep. And Oviedo says that they were nervous still. Most of the Christians actually stayed up all night keeping watch. The next day after sunrise, Enrique came back with about 50 of his men to the savannah. There, Don Enrique said goodbye to Barrio Nuevo and his men. They embraced each other and their soldiers, and Enrique even gave two of his men to Barrio Nuevo to accompany them to the sea where his boat was still waiting. And these two Tainos who were under Enrique's command actually went on the boat. They decided to stay and rest a day and ate with Barrio Nuevo and his men. But Barrio Nuevo and one of the captains, one of Enrique's captains, actually got extremely sick because they drank so much wine. Because it seemed that they had participating in smoking some tobacco, and the mix of the wine with the tobacco made them very ill. They were so ill that they almost died. And Oviedo said that this would have been such a huge inconvenience because the person who had detailed the piece was Barrio Nuevo. He had to return with the details in order to seal the piece. If not, everything would have fallen apart. So both the native and Barrio Nuevo were given some remedies. They had oiled, they were filled with oil to try to counteract the effects of the tobacco and the wine. And the point of the oil was to make them vomit. And they succeeded in doing so, and so they were able to recover. Barrio Nuevo then sent the native, who was accompanied by other people, back to Enriquillo, but not empty handed. He sent back clothes and different garments, some made of silk for him and Mencia. And this was to further establish that peace, because for the Spanish, the exchange of gifts usually meant a treaty of peace, even though they were renowned for breaking it whenever they felt like it. But on the boat stayed one principal Taino, who Enrique had entrusted as his representative to go and present himself before la Audiencia Real de Santo Domingo. Barrio Nuevo took this indigenous man all through different villages, proclaiming that peace had been gained with Enriquillo. And this again was to cement the peace. He needed everybody to know. And he knew that Enriquillo would try to see if the peace had been announced, because if it had been announced, then it was sealed. And this particular native who represented Enriquillo isn't named at first. Some people believe that it's El Indio Gonzalo, but again, in Oviedo's account, he's not named. So he ends up going to la Audiencia Real, to Santo Domingo, being treated with the utmost respect, given supplies and clothes for Enriquillo and his wife. And Oviedo says that this native was slick because he went into different people's homes, including royal officials, to kind of get a feel for how people were feeling about this treaty. But Oviedo says that maybe he also wanted to just drink wine because he was given wine in every single house. But that everyone showed him great respect and were very pleased and overjoyed in the peace and the friendship that was finally had with Don Enrique. Finally, la Audiencia Real arranged another boat to take this representative of Enrique back to Enrique, and he sent with them a lot of fine silks and adornments for himself and Doña Mencia, because by gaining the title of Don, Enrique also gained it for his wife, meaning that now she was seen as part of the nobility and also was deserving of the respect that wasn't given to her when she was violated by Valenzuela's son. Oviedo says that she was sent jewels and that their yucayeque were sent a provision of food, wine, oil, tools, and axes for their farming, even though, again, supposedly Don Enrique had only requested religious images to be sent to him. Oviedo says that they were aware that this was Enrique's petition, but since they were representing the king himself, they thought it was necessary to include all of these other items to further strengthen this peace treaty. And as Oviedo says, para tener este cacique más obligado es rectificar la paz, lo asentado con él. Y también porque estos indios son gente de poca capacidad, no puestos en los primeros de la verdad e honra en sus circunstancias de ella. Otras gentes miran y observan cuando semejantes paces se hacen y contraen con los enemigos. What a change of tone there. Oviedo says that this was necessary because the natives had very poor capacity to keep peace treaties. I'm pretty sure he's talking about the Spanish, but projecting it onto the natives. Oviedo says that in his time, the peace was preserved. Enriquillo did not revolt again. Interestingly, though, he does comment on the fact that some people on the island were directly benefiting from Enriquillo's rebellion. He doesn't go into detail, he just says that there would be only two types of men who would be happy with the continuation of the war with Enriquillo. One would have been the soldiers, the poor soldiers who were benefiting from being paid to go and fight in the war, and those who laid their hands indirectly into the profits that was being gained. And then he says that there's actually another group of people who were happy about this war, and that those people could not consider themselves Christian or servants of the king, but instead of the devil, because those men were greater enemies than Enrique himself. This tells me something super important. There were people in Santo Domingo who were actively supporting Enrique's rebellion and the rebellion of the other natives and the Africans. What I find strange is that they're not specific as to who these people were and how they were benefiting from this. And we actually don't have any documents talking about who these other people were. But I'm going to put my 2 cents in here. My only conclusion is that somebody was supplying them. There was a market open for their weapons, even their food. Because if you think about it, he had over 400 people hiding in the mountains with him. They were moving the women and children every couple of days from different yucayecas. That's a lot of people. Somebody had to be supplying food. Somebody had to be supplying what they needed. So yeah, there was a network of people directly benefiting from La Guerra de Bauruco. In Barrio Nuevo's report to the king, he reports the peace with Enriquillo and tells him that the island is completely out of control. People were killing each other and no laws were being respected. He urged the king to do something. Barrio Nuevo had been right. Enrique placed himself in the entrance of Asua on August 27th, 1533. He was actually at the foot of La Sierra de los Pedernales, and he brought with him about 50 to 60 men to make sure that everything was safe. He then sent one Taino to inquire into the town if anybody was willing to speak with him. The villagers of Asua sent word back saying, of course we'll speak to you. We know of the pardon that the Majesty has given you, so you're more than welcome here. Oviedo recounts that some gentlemen and men of honor of the city actually went out to meet him on horseback, as well as other people of importance of the town. There are about 25 on horseback and over 50 on foot. They were all well equipped for war, which made Enrique a bit nervous. But they all dismounted, approached Enrique, and they all embraced him. And it was in Asua and the people of Asua from whom Enriquillo came to find out that the peace was official, and that Barrio Nuevo had formalized their agreement before La Audiencia Real and the king. And here is where we get the mention of Gonzalo. Some have stated that this Gonzalo is the Indian who went with Barrio Nuevo to Santo Domingo. But it was in Asua that Enrique asked the townspeople if they knew where Gonzalo was. He was concerned because he hadn't seen him again. And not only that, but the items that were sent with Gonzalo, assuming that this is the same native from La Capital, hadn't reached Enriquillo either. The people of Asua told him, yes, he was actually left here from a ship that had come from Santo Domingo, but he's been gone 4 days now. He supposedly went to look for you. It seemed that this brought relief to Enrique, and he actually sent out men to try to follow the coastline to see if they could find Gonzalo, or at least find the ship, which should still be nearby. And while that was happening, he actually stayed in Aswa. And the people there enjoyed his company. He was able to eat with them and converse with them. It says that they brought out plenty of food, chickens, meats, and hams, and they had the best bread and wine around. And all the Christians and all the principal Indians who were accompanying Enriquillo at the time all sat down together to eat. However, again it was noted que Don Enrique did not eat anything. Oviedo notes that Francisco Davila, who was a councilman of the city, was there and shared this piece of information that it was obvious that Enrique was very ill because Enrique himself said that he wasn't feeling well and that he had supposedly already eaten before arriving to Aswa. He noted that Enrique did not smile, that he was very grave and spoke with everybody, but that he was very calm with a very authoritative demeanor. But he did show that he was happy and that he was very content with the peace that had been brought and that he was now a great friend of the Christians. Oviedo says that they were there for about 4 hours and that Riquillo had about 30 of his men still with him by the end of this feast, in that they wouldn't let go of their lances, their swords, their shields, or their daggers. The men and gentlemen of the city of Aswa, or the town of Aswa, let Enrique know that he was more than welcome to any town on the island, that he could enter the city of Santo Domingo, that he would be granted anything he wished, and that it was proclaimed everywhere that he was now a brother of the Christians. He then said goodbye to them because apparently he had not entered the actual town of Aswa at this time. He was still a couple of miles away and they had gone to meet him there. He then said that he needed to leave. He wanted to go and find Gonzalo. So he went along the coast. He turned around the same way he had come, through La Sierra de los Pedernales. And after he had walked a little bit of a distance, he turned back and realized that the people were still there and that they were watching him. And the people of Aswa then realized that it wasn't just Enrique and these 30 to 50 men that they had seen. There was so many of them up in the mountain that were hidden. And this was a shock to the people in the town, but the people of the town was a shock to Enrique because he thought he had gone to Aswa because he thought it was a little town and that there weren't a lot of people. So seeing all these people come out did surprise him and probably scared him a bit because it wasn't just the people of the town that had come out. There had come out blacks and Indian slaves, a large number of them, who had brought out the food to serve everybody. This interaction with Aswa let Enrique know because remember, he had been in the mountains for 13 years. He hadn't gone near any Spanish settlements. But now this short interaction let him know that in the bigger cities like Santo Domingo, there had to be hundreds of more people than what he had encountered in Asua. A couple of days after this, finally Gonzalo and the gifts arrived to Enrique. It was later on known that Enrique and his wife were very happy with the gifts, and they knew this because Enrique fulfilled his other promise to capture fugitive Indians and blacks and return them to the crown. And so he had sent back on the boat 4 or 5 enslaved black people and other fugitive Indians whom he had taken from the Christians. And he sent word that any of any enslaved person, black or Indian, escaped the Christians, that they should inform him because he would have them searched for and sent back to their masters in accordance to the agreement that he had accepted with Barrio Nuevo. And so Enrique was sent back a payment, the amount that Barrio Nuevo had set for each head, and returned with this money to Enrique. The crown is informed of the success of Barrio Nuevo in this letter of 1st of September of 1533. In it is a quick summary of how the peace happened and what was Enrique's response. But there's tidbits of information in this letter that isn't told by Oviedo. And one of the pieces of information is that Barrio Nuevo says he didn't see Enriquillo's wife because she supposedly was also ill. And that the native who supposedly took them to Enriquillo had actually been running away from Enriquillo, and that's why he was so willing to take them to him. And we see this happen in every rebellion, right? There's always somebody that is not happy with what is happening and will go to the other side to screw the rebel over. He also says that they actually had to use the mestizo who was there to communicate with the natives that belonged to Enriquillo because they hadn't brought anybody who could translate. Barrio Nuevo also says that Enriquillo era bien entendido, that he was greatly respected by the natives under his command. They feared him. And we see the great concern that they have about precariousness of this peace. And they even mention the previous peace made with Hernando de San Miguel, that it didn't last because certain things weren't put into place to make sure that the peace was established. It was of utmost importance that this peace be everlasting. And so it says here that juntamos en esta real audiencia al obispo de Venezuela y a los oficiales y regidores y vecinos más principales, y después de haber platicado con ellos, a todos parecido que para asentar y confirmar esta paz, pues tan sospechosa quedaba, era menester más comunicarse con Enrique. And so they decided to send Pedro Romero, someone who was familiar with Enriquillo and the situation, and Martín Alonso. And they were sent with another two principal Indians, images, and a bell for his church, for Enriquillo's church, because this was something that he had also asked for. Barrio Nuevo also stated that in the bohios were crosses. Every single bohio had a cross. And they also found that the roosters' tongues had been cut out so that they wouldn't make noise. And so they sent these men out to further confirm the peace with Enrique. They also noted in here that it took 120 gold pesos to get all the things that Gonzalo brought to Enriquillo, the wine, the oil, all the tools. It wasn't free. The crown paid for it. Pedro Romero was also charged with reading all of these letters to Enriquillo, giving him all of these things, but also inquiring when he wanted Franciscan monks to come by, because Enriquillo had said that there were many children who needed to be baptized. Audiencia Real, who wrote this letter, also lets the crown know that they had informed all of the villages on the island about the peace and that there were letters that had been written to be read out to everybody. In the second portion of this letter, the audiencia lets the crown know that Pedro Romero had actually left about 15 days before, and they were waiting to hear what was the result of their meeting, and that they were hoping to slowly convince Enriquillo to come down from the mountain and live in La Sabana, because Enriquillo was a symbol, and they needed to reduce the symbol, bring him down, so that the other rebels in all of the Spanish colonies would hear about Enrique's subjugation. The third portion of this letter clearly states that because Enriquillo's revolt started because of the mistreatment of the Spanish, that they made it clear to the Spanish settlers that they were not allowed to go visit Enriquillo. He was free and he needed to be left alone. And this was to prevent another uprising. Point number 4 here states something that contradicts Oviedo's account, because here it says that Enrique never even saw his female relatives that went to see him and that he really wanted to see them. However, I think it's not that there's a contradiction. I think it's that they took the female relative. She spoke to his representatives, but didn't actually get to see him. They were sent back to the ship once they had been able to ascertain that communication that Barrio Nuevo wanted. Here it says, though, that even though he didn't get to see them, he did send them hammocks and other things. This letter continues on with different points, but it's in point 12 that Don Enrique is mentioned again. Here, La Audiencia Real tells the crown about what happened in Asua. And their version of the story is a bit different because they state that Enriquillo estaba temeroso y que tuvieron que certificarle que las paces eran verdaderas. Here they kind of get everything together, because it's all bits and pieces all over the place. So remember that the Indian who had been sent by Enrique to Capital. So we have confirmation that this is Gonzalo. So the person who took Gonzalo back, who was trying to get him back to Enriquillo, was Pedro Romero. So this arrangement that they had made wasn't just to cement that peace. It was literally to get Gonzalo and the gifts back to Enriquillo. Here they say that Enrique was in Asua for 5 hours instead of four. So it's little details like that that can transform a story. He quickly left to try to follow this boat. They continued saying here que cada día nos vamos más satisfaciendo de la paz y creemos que muy en breve lo traeremos a tierra llana. But they show concern because they mention here in the bottom, they have heard that Enrique has not eaten with any of the Spanish. That his natives, right, the Tainos under him, they've eaten everything that has been given to them. Pero que ellos lo encuentran sospechoso. They find it suspicious. Why is he not eating? Now we know later on that it was because he was ill. This seems to be consistently talked about. Él no comía. And we know that he died very quickly after gaining peace. It isn't until the 20th of October of 1533 that we hear about what happened with Pedro Romero and his boat. Remember that Pedro was sent out to bring back Gonzalo and find Enriquillo, give him all these gifts. He was finally able to find Enrique, and he states that he was taken to where Mencia and the other indigenous women were. And the letter states that era un lugar el cual dice que estaba en parte a donde jamás los españoles habían llegado, en un lugar tan fragoso y escondido que nos dicen que fueron casi imposibles hallarle aquel asiento y que juntos de él tenía muy grandes jaguayes. So if you guys remember from my episode 5, jaguayes was more common in Higüey. These were stone holes that they would carve out in order to gather rainwater. Here they describe the jaguayes as caves, that they were going to use these caves to hide him and his people if they were to be found. It could be that in the last 50 years of the Spanish conquest, jaguayes, the word, was now being used to describe caves. The letter also says that there were about 400 people with Enriquillo, chicas y grandes, and that Romero spent about 8 days with Mencia, Enriquillo, and the women, and that when Romero returned, he actually brought back a letter from Enriquillo, described how grateful he was for the mercies of the crown. That from then on, he was going to be a great friend to the Spanish, to show his willingness to continue in this friendship. He sent back 6 black slaves that he had captured. And they also write the following: manera que con esta que se ha hecho, tenemos por cierto que se guardará la paz. The 12th of September of 1533, Barrio Nuevo himself writes to the crown, giving his version of the events. And it's constantly repeated Enrique's willingness to work with the crown and return runaway slaves, both blacks and Indians. On the 20th of February of 1534, we have a response from the crown. They include a letter to Enrique thanking him for his cooperation, also asking La Audiencia Real to give to Enrique whatever he needs for that peace to be sustained. It's interesting that we don't have a digitized copy of this letter, but it is found in the documents for Panama, in el Archivo General de las Indias in Sevilla, España. And we see that the war began to wrap up. They became more confident in that the peace was going to be sustained. And we even have a letter from the 13th of March of 1534, where another boat that was used in La Guerras de Bauruco is giving in receipts. They want to be compensated for what they wasted in the war. And then we finally have a response from Enriquillo himself. This letter was lost until 1935, when in an article called La Instrucción de Enriquillo, this letter was referenced, but not even one of the most renowned Dominican scholars, Emilio Rodriguez de Morici, could find this letter. They went to El Archivo General de las Indias in Sevilla twice trying to find this letter. And finally, in 1954, he found a clue in the work of Hank E. de Jimenez Fernandez, titled Bartolomé de las Casas, 1474 to 1566, Bibliografía Crítica. There he learned the location of this letter, published the contents in Clio, the Dominican Historical Magazine, number 114, page 15. And this is the transcribed letter. I'll move so you can see it. And this is the only letter we have written by a Taino in the 1500s, and it's priceless. Here we get to hear the voice of Enriquillo. Many think that he didn't write it because he had been so ill. However, even if someone wrote it for him, we can still hear his voice. It's dated the 6th of June of 1534. In this letter, we can see obvious that this whole situation wasn't something he wanted. It was something that he was forced to do. He says that immediately that he saw the royal orders, he obeyed them. He also says that he actually went out to chase these cimarrones, or the runaway slaves that were roaming the mountains. So it doesn't seem that he actually gave in the cimarrones that were with him, that had fought with him. It seems like these were other people that he had captured later on. He does promise to stop the other indigenous people who were rebelling against the crown. And he says, a vuestro real servicio en el cual me ocuparé todos los días de mi vida, con toda posibilidad. He asked to be counted as one of the many loyal subjects to the crown. And he also tells Her Majesties that he has sent over Fray Francisco de Bobadilla and to please grant him an audience. And this is very common at the time, that you would send out a religious man to kind of be your lawyer and to fight for you in the royal courts, especially in front of the king. And we can assume that he went and met with Francisco de Bobadilla, the fry, because remember Francisco de Bobadilla, there was another one who died in the early parts of the conquest. This is not the same person. So it's obvious that he went and met with this friar in order to give him the information that he wanted him to convey to the king. He then wishes on the king more prosperity, the addition of more kingdoms and dominions, as his imperial heart desires. And I don't have a copy of the back of this letter, but behind it, it says, de Don Enrique Indio, Isla Española, a su majestad. And down below here in this very corner is the beginning of Enrique's signature. The rest of this, if you can tell here, the rest of the letter is ripped. It's very possible that the letter that Enriquillo wrote was actually written when he went to visit Santo Domingo in June of 1534. And it is this letter of 1st of August of 1534 that we learn that Enriquillo and his wife actually visited Santo Domingo in June of 1534. In this letter, we're also informed of another letter sent on the 14th of January of 1534, where the crown tells La Audiencia Real to give Enriquillo everything that he asked for. As it says up here, en que nos manda que se cumpla con el cacique Don Enrique las cosas que con él asentó el capitán Francisco de Barrio Nuevo, y que su persona sea bien tratada. And this letter lets us know that the crown had written another letter to Enriquillo. And La Audiencia Real said that they would make sure that the letter was sent to Enriquillo through a trustworthy person, porque aunque es indio, parece persona de buen entendimiento. Y conocerá el bien y merced que vuestra majestad le hace en el mande al escribir y recibir por su vasallo. In other words, we're going to give him the letter because we think he understands how amazing it is that you even write to him. They continuously mention Mencia, and they state that it's not a little thing that has been done to get these two into peace treaty with the Spanish, and that by their own accord, they came to Santo Domingo about 2 months before this letter was written, meaning around June. Nobody forced them. They came on their own. And they spent about 20 days in La Ciudad de Santo Domingo. They didn't come by themselves, though. They came with about 20 other indigenous captains. The letter states that they were treated very well by everyone, all the officials of La Audiencia Real, and that they even visited them in their homes. They were given some clothes and other valuables. They say that he was so happy, that Enriquillo was so happy with how he has been treated, that he actually decided to settle in the nearby village of Orcera, because that's where they actually had their settlement, and they already had gardens and houses. This letter lets us know what is happening after Enriquillo makes the peace. Because here it says that Enrique informs the crown that Tamayo, his other captain, has gone rogue. He offers to capture Tamayo and bring him out of his rebellion. He tells them that Tamayo could probably start causing a lot of damage to Spanish settlements as he had done before. He encouraged La Audiencia Real to set out a warrant for his arrest and to appoint 2 of his captains to actually chase him down. They gave consent to this, and they were even given special powers so that they could capture Tamayo. It continues on saying that Enriquillo was very pleased with this, and that in regards of the rest of his journey to these kingdoms, that it didn't seem necessary because his presence was now beneficial to the island. They don't clarify what they mean, what kingdoms, what journey. At some point after Enrique makes the peace with the Spanish, Bartolomé de las Casas actually visits him. This is told by Oviedo, though. Bartolomé doesn't mention visiting Enriquillo. Oviedo says that Bartolomé learned about Enriquillo's treaty with the Spanish and went out to kind of console him and advise him in keeping this peace. He stayed with Enriquillo for several days, practicing mass every day. Bartolomé assured Enriquillo that the crown would keep his word. It was different with the officials of the island, but the king himself would make sure that his word was kept. He then went to Asua with Bartolomé de las Casas, with many of his indigenous men, women, and children, and even Tamayo went with them and was baptized by Bartolomé de las Casas. And that after all of this, they went back up into the mountain because they had still not come down yet, and that they were all very happy, praising God. And Oviedo says that during the entire time that Enriquillo rebelled, he always fasted on Fridays, he always prayed. He notes that as cacique, Enrique put certain rules in place. And one of the rules was that the men couldn't marry until they were 25 years old. And this was to prevent them from having sexual relations with the women because it was believed that they would lose their strength for battle. Oviedo says that it was Bartolomé de las Casas that shared this tidbit with him, but he also says that La Audiencia Real was very angry at Bartolomé de las Casas for going off to see Enriquillo when they had specifically said that no Spanish should approach him to avoid having him fall into rebellion again because he had gone without their permission. And they were happy that the encounter was peaceful and that it seemed to strengthen Enriquillo's resolve to maintain the peace. And we don't hear anything more about Enriquillo. All we know is that he didn't live very long after this. On the 12th of October of 1535, we learn that Enriquillo had died about 20 days before this date, giving us a date of about the 27th of September of 1535. And the letter says, El cacique don Enrique falleció habrá 20 días. Escríbenos que murió como cristiano habiéndose confesado y recibido los sacramentos, y mándose enterrar en una iglesia de la villa de Asua, que está cerca de su pueblo. Hizo testamento y dejó por herederos a doña Mencia, o Mencía, here it has an accent, su mujer, y a Martín de Alfaro, we remember him from when Barrio Nueva went to see him, su primo, el cual luego concurrió a esta real audiencia y nos pidió confirmación para que los indios les tuviesen por sus caciques. Y porque nos pareció que así convenía, para asegurar el pueblo, se le proveyó hasta que vuestra majestad otra cosa provea y mande. So Alfaro, his cousin, went to la audiencia real to secure their positions as caciques. So Mencia became cacica and Alfaro became el cacique. I started editing and forgot I didn't finish the video. We know that el pueblo de Enrique y Mencia lived for many, many years in las faldas de las sierras de Bauruco. And we know they lived there peacefully at least until the beginning of 1547, ironically having 14 years of peace. But in July of 1547, we find out el Doctor Montaño, dean de la Catedral de Santo Domingo, que los negros alzados habían acabado con el pueblo de Enriquillo y que quedaban solo 8 a 10 de estos indios que eran parte del pueblo de Enrique, and that they actually went back and tried to get revenge against the blacks who had destroyed their town. In the letter of El Doctor Montaño, we also learn that he believes that there's only about 150 natives left of the Tainos on the entire island. That many who are natives were brought from other islands and from the mainland. Learning about what happened to Enriquillo's pueblo just broke my heart. Reading about his struggles and everything he went through to keep his people safe, and then to have this happen. We know that there were others who continued rebelling after Enriquillo. One of them was Murcia, who I mentioned at the beginning, and he continued his rebellion all the way to 1544, and he was then offered a treaty with the king, and he accepted it. And we know of a letter of April 24th, 1545, where it is asked on behalf of Murcia by el cacique Garci Hernández to add el cacique Murcia to his service as a vassal to the crown. And it's explained that él estaba alzado en los montes, aunque no hacía ningún mal. So Murcia was different in this aspect, where he didn't really interact with the Spanish at all. He avoided them at all costs. But again, all of these different rebels just gave hope to other people on the island, and they'd rather just get a treaty in there, get them out of the mountains peacefully so that their slaves wouldn't have symbols of resistance to take inspiration from. And this is where Enriquillo's story ends. We have no other information about what happened to the rest of the people who survived. We don't know how long Mencia lived for, if she survived the massacre of 1547. We do know that in the 19th century, after the book Enriquillo, la novela de Manuel de Jesús Galván, there was an interest in finding more about Enriquillo. And then later on in the 20th century, so in the 1900s, there was interest in finding out where Enriquillo was buried. What I've been able to find is that at least since 2019, archaeological investigations led by Lidia Martinez de Macarrulla have been excavating in Asua. I'm going to do an entirely different video about where this excavation is right now, who is sponsoring it. Hopefully I can find that. I would love to know who is helping economically with this. Enriquillo is the most documented Taino cacique that we have. He's recorded in so many sources, and each document gives us a little bit more of information about him and what was happening at the time, and also lets us know what he was actually fighting for. Because many believe him to be a symbol of resistance and rebellion, and that he was a warrior against the Spanish crown. But in reality, after doing all this research, his situation was much more complicated. Known as being a devout Catholic, educated by Franciscan monks, even the bohios that they would find when they were chasing him were filled with crosses. This was a huge moral dilemma, because the Catholic Church taught that you had to respect the king, almost as if he was God himself. But I believe that Enriquillo saw his role as husband as more important than that. In reality, for me, Enriquillo's story is a love story. A story of sacrifice. Because he could have turned a blind eye to Valenzuela abusing his wife. His life would not have been disrupted. And in my mind, I can just imagine his heart breaking and just being engulfed in that feeling that you get when you are a victim of injustice. That rage, that helplessness, and maybe even despair when he realized that he couldn't protect Mencia. Did he see her cry? Did he see her maybe balled up, humiliated by what had happened to her? She was part of Taino nobility. Or maybe her pride didn't allow her to tell him anything. Did he just find her with tears streaming down her face in just agony, in disgrace? Did he hold her as she cried? Did he tell her that he would fix it? That he would protect her? That no one would hurt her ever again? He tried to go the legal route first, going to la Audiencia Real, presenting his case, filing a lawsuit. He was ignored. So his only option was to go up into the mountains with his wife. And the documents mention her over and over again. She's everywhere. She was with him everywhere he went. Every yucayeque, every bohio, every forest, every savanna, in every river, every lake, every cove. She was just nearby, waiting for him to come back. And every night he did. When she was finally given the title of Doña Mencia, she was sent silk and jewels from Santo Domingo. And it was this title that protected her from what Enriquillo could not. I can just imagine him so happy, ecstatic, with that letter from the king, going back to see her after speaking with Barrio Nuevo and telling her we did it. She knew what this meant. Don Enrique gave his life for his wife, and he probably died in her arms on September 27th, 1535. Out of all the stories I did in this series, and I'm missing one, by far Enriquillo's story really transformed the way I saw the resistance of the Tainos, because they weren't actually going against the crown. I think that's a misconception. It was really about them as individuals. They didn't want to be in this system. They weren't actually fighting for the rest of them, but that's okay. They knew what they needed to do to keep themselves and their families safe. Me faltan palabras para describir cómo la historia de Enriquillo me ha impactado. But I hope that everyone who takes the time to watch these videos to get a real sense of what happened during that time will also be inspired and know that sometimes hard decisions have to be made, but it is always worth it to do it for your supportive family.